Over the course of my career, I've had the opportunity to be a guest on a bunch of different podcasts, but one that really stuck out to me was called My Favorite Mistake, and it's hosted by Mark Graban. Well, Mark Graban gets all of these people to come on and talk about, some of the blunders that they've made in their professional career, myself included. And I thought that's such an interesting idea to get people who have had, some success in their lives to talk about places where they had a misstep. So I was delighted to see that he had taken the conversations from that podcast and put them into book form. It's called The Mistakes That Make Us. And I thought I would take advantage of my own podcast to talk to him about it and find out what themes he was able to pull out. He's going to share them with you coming up. Hi, I'm Karin Reed. I'm a 4-time author, Emmy Award-winning broadcast journalist, and communication expert on helping people to own the room, whether it be a physical one or a virtual one. Welcome to Speaker Dynamics. Mark, I am delighted to have you on the show. I'm also delighted to be in the role of interviewer rather than interviewee. I'm much more comfortable in this space because we go back, I can't remember how many years ago it was that I was on your podcast, My Favorite Mistake, which I remember was really a fascinating approach to a podcast. And I didn't get to ask you then, but I'm going to ask you now, what made you decide to focus on mistakes?
Well, thank you. And thank you for being a guest. I mean, you're really good on both sides of this equation here. I looked up, it was episode 162. It was about 2.5 years ago.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
If people want to go look that up, that's still out there. But to your question of why I started doing this, I mean, I started podcasting back in 2006, actually.
It was just in its infancy.
It was very much in its infancy. And I was doing a podcast, and I still do that podcast. It's very focused on what we call lean management. A lot of it's based on the Toyota production system. So I talk to people from all sorts of other different industries about that. And when you do a podcast long enough, you get on these lists of, PR firms and guest bookers who start reaching out and say, we want you to interview so-and-so. And because that lean podcast is very niche, I mean, and more often than not, I just say, well, no, I just hit delete, or no, thank you, but it doesn't fit the podcast. And I had some guests that I said no to where I started regretting, like, let me find a way to say yes instead of no. And the tipping point was an invitation to interview Kevin Harrington, who was one of the sharks on season 1 of Shark Tank. And I thought I would really love to meet him. Maybe, and this is, summer of 2020, so I'm not traveling as a consultant and a speaker. I'm looking for a pandemic project. I thought maybe I should start a new podcast that would allow me to interview basically anybody I find interesting. And kind of went back and forth with the PR folks, and Kevin thought that was a great idea. And he ended up being the guest in episode 1 of My Favorite Mistake. And then I thought, well, I hope I can find other people also willing to, really humbly and openly share a story about a mistake and what they've learned. So I'm glad that you did that, Karin, and your co-author, Joe, and at this point, almost 300 other people really from all walks of life and all industries. So it's been fascinating.
Well, congratulations to you for your longevity and your success. I mean, that blows my mind when you throw out those numbers that, are 3 digits. I'm like, hey, I made it to like 25. For me, that seems like a lot more than I ever anticipated. So, but I love the concept and I love the idea. And I also think it's interesting that you are asking, not including myself in this category, but people like a Kevin Harrington who, might have an ego, associated with themselves. And is it difficult to get people to talk about a mistake they've made?
Almost everybody that I've had on the show has been really open with the idea of sharing a mistake. I mean, if there's people who don't want to do that, maybe they don't reply to the pitch or the connection invitation.
Yeah.
But I think a couple things help. One, I'm not asking what's your biggest mistake. Like that might trigger a lot of sadness. That might not be fun to talk about. But
Right.
I think starting with the word favorite, it catches people off guard because it's a positive way of framing it. That's what the podcast is all about. It's not, come on here and get yelled at for making a mistake or to be shamed by the audience. It's really meant to reflect the idea that we all make mistakes. So let's do what we can to learn from them. And, people coming on who are very successful, or, maybe Kevin Harrington and a lot of people on the show don't have a lot to lose at this point, right? So ego, confidence. I think there's this combination of, I would call it confident humility. You've got to be confident enough to realize this isn't going to kill my reputation to share a story, but it might benefit others who might be afraid or uncomfortable, in admitting mistakes to themselves or to their employees. Yeah. So I think it ends up being a positive thing that people want to be a part of.
Yeah, that confident humility is actually a hallmark of executive presence, which is something that, I spend a lot of time working in. So that makes a lot of sense. And I will definitely agree that you learn so much more from your mistakes, perhaps, than your victories. And I always enjoy sharing those with others because, oftentimes they're from like my old TV news days and they still have applicability to what I do today. But I want to shift focus a little bit about your shift in focus to putting your podcasting work into a book. So your book is called The Mistakes That Make Us. I know you've written several books, but this is the most recent. So The Mistakes That Make Us. What prompted you to take your mission from your podcast and put it into book form? There you go.
Hold well done. For a second. You always got to have a book handy. You have yours behind you, right?
I do. It's shameless self-promotion.
It's great. No, it's great. So to this day, I do not remember which guest it was. It was a guest back in the first 20 episodes who, after we finished recording, asked me fairly point blank, so are you doing this podcast because you're writing a book about mistakes? And I thought, actually, I've written before. You think I would be thinking that way, but I was enjoying the podcast space. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. Now, shame on me for not also filing away who suggested it.
And but they know who they are somewhere, Mark. Maybe they'll reach out to you.
Well, and I admitted that mistake in the introduction to the book of, the story of how the book came to be, that if you're reading this and you think that was you, please let me know. I would love to more publicly thank that guest.
Yeah.
But then, it was probably about 2 years ago now, or a little earlier, where I thought, I do have there's a lot of stories, and I think I'm good at connecting dots between different stories. And, I thought, okay, yeah, there's a lot of great stories that could, I think, be turned into a book. And so, I started writing. As with a lot of things, what I started writing isn't what the book turned out to be. Like, I was really relying very heavily at first on guest stories. And my editor, who I've known a long time, was reading. He's like, your voice isn't coming through, though. And you have experiences. I've made many mistakes, and I share some of those in the book. My editor encouraged me to kind of take a fresh start of, writing a book that's from a little bit more personal of a perspective, and then using those guest stories to help illustrate key points or themes. And I think the book turned out better that way. And, but yeah, it was really, and then it's a matter of figuring which stories. If I tried including everybody's story, the book would have been too big. I had to pick and choose, and it was hard to have some of it hit the cutting room floor. But no, I'm really appreciative that so many people have shared stories, and that's allowed me to think through a lot of things about mistakes, both for myself and when I'm coaching individuals, or kind of broadening out and coaching leaders and organizations. How do we create a workplace culture where learning from mistakes is the priority instead of punishing mistakes.
Yeah, well, let's actually lean into that because that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. You were saying that you really need to shift, from punishing people who screw up to actually using that as a way to improve, I guess, processes. In fact, you talk about the idea of systemic factors that are often at fault. So, that was a multi-layered question, but I guess first of all, why shift from punishment to an improvement focus?
Well, for one, I think punishment is very, very counterproductive. If leaders get, upset and angry and blamey and judgy, in the moment, it might feel good to take it out on someone or to punish them. But, I've heard some leaders or some people push back and say, well, if I don't punish people for their mistakes, that's going to give people permission to make more. And I'm like, don't I don't think it works that way because mistakes are by definition unintentional. We're doing something we think is the right thing, and it could be then because of a mental lapse, a physical slip up, a bad assumption. A mistake, large or small, is by definition unintended. And when we punish mistakes, that really teaches people to hide and cover up their mistakes. And then we're doomed to repeat them or not learn from them. Or I have so many stories of, an employee getting fired, the systemic cause or causes not being addressed. You bring in someone new and it's just a matter of time now, or sure enough, new person makes that same mistake. It's like, how long are we going to repeat that cycle? So I think the best organizations out there, including some that I visited last week in Japan, really emphasized the idea that they don't punish individuals for systemic problems. We try to prevent problems when we can, but when they occur, we need to embrace them as learning opportunities to say, well, how do we improve our systems, our communication? How do we prevent that same mistake from happening again? Like, to me, that's a much more compelling path to success than just punishing and blaming everybody. Or like, if we're going to do that, let's proactively fire the people who are mistake prone. And like, well, that could be anybody.
Right. And I like how you mentioned that, it's a mistake is, not on purpose. Like that's the nature of the mistake. So it's also separating out the motivator, right? If there's a nefarious purpose for what occurred, then that's not a mistake. That's an
No,
intentional act of perhaps sabotage. But
that's the word that would apply.
right.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah. And I'm curious if you shift this, what does that do to the overall culture of the organization? If you go from, well, we're just going to lop off the mistake maker and put somebody else in, how does that change the culture overall?
It changes the culture in a way that helps people speak up, not only about mistakes, but just about anything. So one of the concepts or practices I've been able to study formally in the last couple of years and incorporated into the book is this idea of psychological safety. If people feel a high degree of psychological safety, that means they feel safe to speak up without fearing punishment or retribution in some way. So that includes speaking up about mistakes. And I think of examples. There's a software company that I've been involved with a long time called KaiNexus, where the CEO, co-founder, and other senior leaders are really open about sharing their mistakes. And in fact, Greg, the CEO, did that today in an all-hands weekly meeting of talking about how he screwed something up. So he's showing some humility, but he's confident enough, to admit it. There's that confident humility. Mm-hmm. He shared how somebody gave him some pretty pointed feedback. And I know Greg reacted to it well and positively, and kind of told the story, and without naming names, was thanking the person or people who gave the feedback and telling the story as a reminder to everybody else that even though I'm the CEO, I'm not infallible. If I'm wrong or if I'm missing something, I want you to tell me. So that includes admitting mistakes, saying, I don't know, things that might get you punished in some workplaces. When leaders lead by example, then people decide, yeah, it is safe to admit a mistake, to point out a problem, to share an improvement idea, to disagree. I've been in workplaces where I'd like to think by nature, I like to challenge things and speak up. But at the same time, I can be taught to keep quiet. And that's where, I think I've learned a lot of this is such a function of culture. It's not that you can just go hire brave people,
Yeah.
And so I think leaders leading by example sets the tone where others can admit mistakes. And then, on top of psychological safety, we need to have effective problem solving, because we don't want the same mistakes being repeated over and over again, prompting the same non-punitive response over and over. We need to, figure out how do we prevent mistakes from happening again. And I think that leads to all sorts of improvement and innovation and business progress.
As you're talking about this, I'm thinking about how much more effort, though, it would take, Mark, to actually go about trying to fix the processes than to simply say, you messed up, you're out of here. Is that often the biggest barrier to, addressing those systemic factors, just because it's easier just to get rid of the one problem, right?
Mm-hmm. It could be that, and I think it's often cases. I think it's just been conditioned of leaders saying, "Well, I have to punish people." Maybe that's what they were taught by previous generation of leaders earlier in their career. And I think there's a lot of these things when leaders or business owners maybe catch themselves saying like things like, "Well, I was forced to fire that person." I'm like, "No, you weren't." Like, you might not have considered an alternative, but I'm trying to, in different ways, challenge people to rethink some of these assumptions or habits that, again, you don't have to punish people. A non-punitive response is not giving people permission to be reckless. And if you're hiring good people and you have an environment where people are aligned and committed to the purpose and the success of the organization, I think I think it's just it can be tough, and sometimes it maybe I hope my book or my podcast has sparked at least a few people to step back and rethink, or maybe more realistically, if people are feeling uncomfortable with the punitive approach, like I feel like in my gut this isn't right, but I've been doing it, and maybe the book gives them some confidence to say, yeah, we can take a different path. We can focus on openness and improvement and prevention instead of punishment.
Is this something that has to be established from the top down, or can there be a way to, have it trickle up, by lack of a
Yeah.
better phrase?
I mean, I think for the most part, culture tends to flow down from the top. So I think the ideal situation would be having a CEO and senior executives who are aligned in those mindsets and that approach. And KaiNexus from the beginning, about 12 years ago, has been pretty intentional about building culture. And a lot of startups, I think, don't focus on that. They're really excited about their technology, they're passionate about their customers, but they might have a mindset that says, yeah, we got to get it done no matter what, or we're just too busy to think about that fluffy culture stuff. So I think it's easier to try to establish it from the beginning. If you're in a culture change or turnaround situation, I've seen organizations that I've worked with where even if the CEO and senior people aren't involved in this conversation of a culture of learning from mistakes, let's say somebody who's a manager or a director or a vice president can lead by example, and it can flow down from that leader. But then there's the risk that an executive swoops in and undoes a lot of the trust that had been built up locally. So, an example might be, some sort of really serious mistake that occurs, and an executive swooping in and demanding blaming and punishment, and that could really undo a lot of that culture change. So, I mean, the culture change can happen at more local levels, but there's risk that it can be undone.
Yeah, and so easily, as I'm thinking about examples from clients that I've worked with as well, and You've listened to so many stories of mistakes. Are
Mhm.
there any that stand out to you as more impactful than others? Like, what are some of your favorite mistakes that people have relayed to you?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it's like asking an
There's
author
so
to
many.
choose their favorite book,
Yeah,
or I mean,
the first
I
one.
remember. I mean, I remember your story, clearly about your teleprompter mistake and your first broadcast, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
part of why that resonated with me, as we talked about then, WKBN in Youngstown, Ohio. My
yeah.
grandparents lived near Youngstown, so I watched that station.
Little did you know that the
and
teleprompter was operated by a foot pedal, which, I think I talk about this in one of my own episodes, Mario. I cannot remember when I talked about it. Yeah, but that's fine. That makes me feel good that resonated with you.
yeah,
But, and what did you like about it? Like, what stood out to you aside from you having a local connection?
yeah, and remembering those call letters for some reason
Yeah,
drilled into my head. But
yeah,
no, I mean, I like the story, and not that anyone is using that exact technology today.
yeah.
But from what I remember of how you told it, it was a story of bouncing back and being a little resilient, and your lesson about always having a backup plan. I
Exactly.
thought is a good transferable lesson.
Yeah. I
Um,
will give a very brief summary for listeners. So if you didn't hear it in the other episode, the teleprompter had a conveyor belt of scripts that it would be fed through magically. It would appear on the screen in front of me, and I ran the teleprompter with my foot. It was a pedal, and I was delivering literally my first newscast ever as a news anchor. And I introduced myself and greeted everyone, depressed the pedal, and all the scripts out of the corner of my eye I could see fell onto the floor because there was a forward and there was a reverse on the pedal, and
yeah,
it was in reverse. So I ended up, right, as you mentioned, having to not rely on technology but rely upon paper scripts that I had in front of me on a news desk, which did teach me have a plan B, but also know that technology is fickle. And boy, Mark, do we know that today?
yeah,
I think of all the different times I've logged into the different platforms, whether it be Teams or Zoom. I'm like, why is it not reading my camera today?
yeah,
Why is it deciding this? It doesn't like it
yeah,
anymore.
yeah. But there's
So,
backup plans, right? Like if the internet goes out. Like I was part of a live global virtual webinar conference yesterday, and someone had a power surge, and it took him a minute, but his backup plan was his cell phone and cellular data.
I
Wasn't as
did
good
this.
as being on the Wi-Fi, but
Yeah,
he had a
yeah.
backup plan. And
No, I did the same thing, Mark. I had a 5,000 person webinar, and it was for Europe and folks in Europe, and it was early in the morning. I looked out my window, and my internet supplier had their truck parked right outside my house. I'm like, please don't tell me that you're working on the
yeah,
internet right now. And of course they were. So I used my phone as a hotspot for
yeah,
that. It was terrifying, but it worked. It was another one of those plan B sort of things. But
yeah,
as you were listening to the different mistake stories,
yeah,
were there certain themes that kind of, all
yeah.
wove together?
I think one of the most powerful themes is that nobody has come on the show and blamed or trashed others, even if
Mm.
others were in. Some of the mistakes are very individual, and people come on and they take ownership of what they did and why they thought it was a good decision and why it turned out to be a mistake.
Mm.
There are some stories where other people were involved, and that may have been contributing factors. But again, like I appreciate when people take ownership of what they did. So let me tie in real quickly to the question you asked before of like favorite stories. So
Mm.
one theme or like great opportunity is that I've actually interviewed two sitting members of the US House of Representatives
Mm.
on the podcast.
I'm going to go back and listen to those then, because I want to hear what they thought their mistakes were.
Episode two, Will Hurd, a Republican from Texas
Yeah.
who was on his way out of the House. He had decided not to run, so I guess he felt the freedom to, you know, come on my little podcast. And
Yeah.
then currently still in the House, was reelected again, Democrat Adam Smith from the state of Washington. And
Mhm.
so, look, this is a nonpartisan issue.
Sure.
Um, but what they both talked about were mistakes they made in their first ever campaigns.
Mm.
Will Hurd lost his runoff because he didn't listen to his consultants. And he didn't say, oh, those consultants should have been more convincing. I mean, he owned what he did.
Yeah.
And when he ran again 4 years later, he listened and he won the runoff. Now, Adam Smith's story was the type where he made a mistake, but he adjusted in time to win the election. So good for him. There's a lesson in when you can acknowledge and admit the mistake early so you can adjust quickly.
Yes.
But they both talked about how rare it seems for a politician to be willing to admit a mistake.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that those two did. I admire them greatly for that.
Yeah, those are two, great stories to, hold up to others and say, yeah, this, I also like the idea of, admitting mistakes earlier allows you to pivot sooner and recover faster. Speaking of that, I want to get to the last chapter of your book, which you called Cultivate Forever. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Well, so I'm not a gardener. I'm not a green thumb. But it occurred to me, I think, with culture, including building a culture of learning from mistakes, a culture of learning and innovation, it really does require ongoing effort. So I was maybe torturing the analogy, but you've got to prepare the soil, you've got to plant some seeds, and then as you go through the process of leader behaviors that are watering and fertilizing and pruning and tending to the garden and making sure pests don't come in and cause a problem. That might be the leaders who don't share your perspectives on these things. But culture change is not a project or a training class or an initiative any more than a garden is something that you plant and forget. Or I think it's Kevin Harrington, was this one of his products? You don't set it and forget it. Whatever, remember that infomercial product. Kevin Harrington was the inventor of the infomercial. But it's really, it's an ongoing effort. And I think you have to keep on guard. And at KaiNexus, we do this. I mean, we keep on guard about culture and make sure that the culture's not drifting. As new people come into the company, we make sure that we're introducing them to what our values and expectations are. Now, you can't demand that people feel safe, but you can invite them to speak up. Like you're new here. If you see things that are puzzling or could be done better, please do speak up about it. And the company reacts well, to that. So it really is an ongoing effort. One other thing you can do is, try to quantify these things. There are surveys that you can take. KaiNexus did that kind of as a baseline. Like we thought the level of psychological safety was good, probably not perfect. And the survey showed, that we were in the 80th percentile of technology companies that had taken the same survey. And so we could recognize, okay, well, we've got a good starting point. Now, we're going to do that survey again in the near future. And hopefully things have gotten better because we've more intentionally talked about some of these concepts and the behaviors and reminding leaders if they were doing a lot of this intuitively that, we need to keep our eye on all the aspects of culture that are important, including, a culture that encourages people to speak up and rewards them for that. So again, it's an ongoing thing. We don't want the garden to die.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about was a technique that I discussed in active listening training, where, the goal is to listen without memory and to listen without agenda. So listen without memory means like you're no preconceived notions. So, if somebody has something to say, and they make an observation about how things could be done differently, tell me more about that. That's interesting. Okay. And truly open to hearing what they had to say. And then listening without an agenda is you are not planning the conversation. You're willing to let it go where it needs to go. And so when you're talking about the psychological safety, when you're talking about this culture of learning from mistakes, it feels almost like it's an organization that is an active listener.
Yeah.
So that was the correlation I came up with. But
Yeah. Well, and one other CEO, and this is at the larger scale of things, CEO I've admired for a long time is Larry Culp, the CEO at GE Aerospace, and I saw him speak at a conference about 2 years ago, and he touched on a lot of these key points. He didn't use the phrase psychological safety, but he was talking about the need coming in as an outsider to GE to change a culture that everyone described as a shoot the messenger culture. People learn to keep things quiet, and he realized he needed to change that. And one of the things he talked about as a leader is the idea that you need to be able to react well to bad news and not react emotionally, and kind of be curious. He didn't exactly say this, but I'm thinking of the Ted Lasso quoting whomever of be curious, not judgmental.
yes,
When you hear bad news, and I think there's something to be said for emotional intelligence and self-control, but I think you can't just tell people we're going to stop shooting the messenger and then react badly when people speak up. Like the leader actions need to back up their words. And so, they're in the midst of, culture change at GE Aerospace. And, in that case, it really, it's starting from the CEO on down.
So, fun fact, when I worked for NBC, we were owned by GE, which meant that I used to get my appliances for really cheap, which I always thought was a really strange perk of working at NBC. But I wanted to wrap up our conversation with what I always ask of every guest, which is, can you provide one big takeaway that our listeners and our viewers can contemplate until the next episode?
Yeah, I think one thing that we haven't talked about is, I think a framework I've learned that helps me process a mistake individually. And it's a framework we can use to guide and coach others through thinking through what happened. So when we've made a mistake, you want to kind of just step back and reflect, what were our actions? Like, what did we expect to happen? What actually happened? And then try to think through what we learned from that gap. And, not just second guessing that, well, any decision that had good outcomes was a good idea. Sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes you make the right decision and you get a bad outcome, right? So there's a lot of nuance and context, but just to kind of reflect through why I made that decision, were there certain assumptions that turned out to be untrue? That's usually the big one, right? And so what do we learn from that? What will we do differently in the future? And there's a lesson from entrepreneurship of stating your assumptions and realize, okay, we're going to go do something now. We're testing an assumption. We could be wrong, and that's okay. We could say that's a mistake. That's probably the technically correct term to use, but like it doesn't have to be so emotionally loaded. So I think if we almost expect mistakes to happen, especially if we're entrepreneurs or doing new things, launching a new podcast, we almost have to expect it, invite it, and reflect and learn the best we can.
I love how you reframe that, Mark. Thank you so much. I encourage everybody to pick up your new book, The Mistakes That Make Us. I think you'll see perhaps a lot of things that you can correlate to your own life and learn from them, just like so many others have learned from theirs. And I've learned a lot from you, Mark. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, well, thank you, Karin. Thanks for having me. Thanks again for being a guest on my show, too.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mark as much as I did. And if you'd like to hear more from him, you can by going to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content, where you'll find a mini episode where I turn the tables on Mark and I say, okay, you've heard about everybody else's favorite mistakes. What are some of the mistakes that you've made? And you'll hear what they are and what happened as a result. So if you want to check it out, go to speakerdynamics.com/bonus content. I want to thank you all for listening to this episode. If you like what you hear, please feel free to give us a like, give us a follow, spread the word, let other people know that we are out here so we can continue to grow this community. Until next time, everybody.